Welcome, you beautiful subscribers. Today we are looking at the video settings that I use for the Canon R5C. Hopefully you'll find it useful and interesting. Let's dive straight in. I'll put the timestamps over here so that you can skip to the ones that are most important for you. First, I'll show you the settings that I don't really change very often, regardless of what I'm filming. So the first is shutter mode. We're going to set the menu and we're going to scroll across to shutter mode. Now, I keep this in angle probably 99.9% of the time. If there's a screen in shot or I'm filming a screen, then I'll change that to clear scan and match the rate along the bottom there to try and avoid any flicker. But generally, for most scenarios, I keep that in angle. And then I set that to a 180-degree shutter. That's just at the bottom right over here. So 180-degree shutter. This gives me the most filmic look. I'm rarely shooting cinematic action scenes, so I only ever use a 180-degree shutter setting. Next, I set the base ISO to either 800 or 3200. So that is in menu. And then again, on the same page as shutter mode, we can go down to base ISO and select either 3200 or 800. And I always try and keep the ISO setting at my base ISO. So if I'm shooting in the base ISO of 800, I keep my ISO to 800. If I'm shooting in base ISO 3200, I keep it at 3200. And I rarely bump up higher than this, only if absolutely necessary. And if I can use lights instead, I will, or very fast lenses. Now let's get into the different scenarios and what settings I use for those. And this is all in the quick menu. I don't like to dive into the main menus when I'm out shooting. In the top left-hand side of the screen, you've got this quick menu, which is the piece of film with a cog next to it. If you can't see it, press info until the touch screen comes up and then you can push that. The first one we're going to look at is filming A-roll. So this is filming things like interviews, pieces to camera, anything where quality and backup recordings is a priority. So on the first page, we have these options. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about these just yet. We're going to come back to that and you'll see why. When we change it to RAW, it undoes the settings that we've done in the first page. So we're going to change it to RAW first on the second page. And I use RAW LT. There's RAW ST. It's high quality, but the difference between that and RAW LT is not as noticeable, so I'm not that fussed. I'd rather have the extra space. So RAW LT, well, it's going to turn on sub recording, so I'm going to put it into Canon C-Log 3. And my frame rate at 50 frames a second. And the reason why I'm having it at 50 frames a second is because when you're editing a person speaking and say they make a lot of mistakes, it's much easier to do really fine editing when your file is 50 frames a second. And the beauty of the R5C is you can shoot 50 frames a second, 8K RAW. Oh, and by the way, this is going to be 30p and 60p for anybody in the United States and Canada. So now we've got this page set up, we're going to switch back to the first page and keep it in full frame because often when I'm filming pieces to camera, I like to have nice shallow depth of field, so we're keeping in full frame. And then we're going to change the second setting, which is the second card record functions. We're going to put that into main and sub recording. Because we're shooting in RAW, we can't use pre-recording, which would be nice if we're shooting talent that's going to be speaking quite quickly and we're not necessarily recording, but that doesn't tend to happen when I'm running interviews or pieces to camera. And you've got to make that decision of, is pre-recording more important than RAW? For this scenario, I don't think it is. So keeping that as normal recording. Okay, so we have full frame, main and sub, normal recording. On the first page, on the second page, we have RAW LT, Canon Log 3, and 50 frames a second. Going to go into the third page, and again, the beauty of recording on the R5C is I can shoot XFAVC 422 10-bit as a backup recording. This is actually going to be the one that I'm going to be editing on and using. It's a much smaller file. It's something that's cheaper to store, and I'll keep that card with the RAW until I'm satisfied that the XFAVC looks great and I can use it and it's all graded and ready to go. But it means that I have a RAW file as a backup, so that if I've made any mistakes with my white balance, with my exposure, I can use the RAW file to correct that and fix that. Long up is fine for filming pieces to camera. We don't need all eye unless there's fast motion or nets or anything like that. And because we have that RAW as our backup, it's going to be all eye anyway. 4K long op. So even if your final output is going to be 1080p, I tend to record pieces to camera or any interview scenarios in 4K at least, because then it gives us flexibility in post to crop in and out. and give us a faux B cam. But we've still got that 8K file as well if we need to do some serious cropping in post. And that has actually come in really useful for one where I had to set up the R5C onto a gimbal and stand quite far back from two different people who was talking to each other. I could still crop right into each of their faces to give them their own camera look. Okay, moving on to the next scenario, and this is going to be an all RAW workflow. So if you're somebody who shoots in RAW only and you want to use a RAW file, I would recommend that you have a backup of that RAW file recorded. And the R5C, you can record RAW to both card slots. There are some limitations. First of all, on the second page of the quick menu, we're going to change it to 25p. Here again, you've got to make that decision of which is more important, having that backup RAW file or having 50p. So if we're shooting an interview or a piece to camera, I would go for shooting in 25p because I'd rather have the backup RAW file if RAW is what I'm going to be working with. So RAW LT, 25 frames per second, changing the C-Log 3, that doesn't matter. We're shooting in RAW, it's not going to make a difference. And then we're going to go back across the first menu and change our sensor mode to Super 35. And now this is going to open up within our second card functions, double slot recording, even with RAW. With any of these settings, I never change the main recording destination. CF Express is my main recording destination. So the first page, Super 35, which is the cropped mode on the R5C, double slot recording, normal recording because it's in RAW, we don't get pre-recording again, main recording format, RAW LT, frame rate 25 frames a second, and we can go across. In the third page, there's nothing to change because we're doing a double slot recording, and the third page is only for sub-recordings. Say you have an all RAW workflow where you have a redundant recording on your SD card. So the next scenario is going to be shooting B-roll for, say, a commercial video or an event or anything like that, where we're getting lots of different footage on the fly, and it's all very ad hoc. So not scripted, not interview shots, not anything like that. This is all B-roll shots that's going to be placed over the top of our A-roll. With this, the priority for me is going to be saving space and getting as much footage as possible, which gives me as many options with my edit. What I need to do is change from RAW LT, and I'm going to put that into HEVC 420 10-bit. If you're shooting B-roll where color work is going to be very important, like shooting products where you're going to have to match the colors, then I would suggest doing 422. And especially if you're shooting for broadcast or Netflix, you must choose one of the 422 10-bit options. To save space, I'm going to put it into 10-bit 420. I'm going to leave it in C-Log 3 because often I want the most dynamic range from my B-roll. I think that's where it's more important because I can't control the lighting in all the scenarios. If you're shooting in a scenario where there's going to be a huge dynamic range and you really need to get the most dynamic range out of this camera, that's where you'd use the RAW again. But generally for B-roll, I don't need RAW. So we're going to go HEVC 420 10-bit for the first option, Canon C-Log 3, and we're going to put it into, well, keep it in 4K. That's fine by me, but we're going to change the frame rate to 50 frames a second. So for B-roll, I'm going to shoot in 50p because it gives me the most space and also gives me the flexibility in post to slow things down to half speed. I used to shoot everything at 100 frames a second and it was just overkill, so I like to have double slot recording for this as well so that I have that backup. If I'm shooting on location and it's quite fast paced, I don't want to be changing cards and running out of space on my card, so space efficient is great for this scenario for me. Going back to the first page on the quick menu, I'm going to change that to full frame. This really depends on what lens I'm using. If I'm shooting on the 24-70, I'm going to put that into full frame or any full frame lenses. If I'm shooting on something like the 17-55, I'll put that into Super 35 crop mode. For second card recording functions, I'm going to put that into double slot recording. And then recording mode, I'm going to put that into pre-recording. This is particularly for if I'm shooting events and the action is not going to wait for me. Even the second of putting it up to my eye and pushing the record button, it just means that I've got that little bit of flexibility at the start of a file. First page, full frame or Super 35, depending on what lens you're using. Pre-recording under recording mode. Double slot recording gives us that redundancy. CF Express is always the main recording destination for me. MP4 HEVC 420 10-bit. If color's important, change it to 422. 4K because I can, and C-Log 3 gives us that flexibility in post with a dynamic range. 50p means that we can slow things down to half speed in post. There's nothing on the third page because that's where the sub recordings are. Another reason why I'm shooting in HEVC and not in XFAVC. XFAVC has uncompressed audio, whereas HEVC has compressed audio. So if audio is important, change that to XFAVC, because then you're going to get uncompressed audio. As you can see, the file size, it's 90 megabits a second, greater file size. So yeah, that's why I like 420 10-bit. So the next scenario for me, every now and then I shoot long form events, and this is going to be putting the camera on a tripod, pushing record, and just letting it capture all the action without having to move the camera or change things around. We'll often set up more than one camera. Here the priority for me is not having to change card slots. So we're going to go for the smallest file, and also I don't want to have to be grading an entire hour to 2 hour long event. So what I'll do is put it into an easier color space. So on the first page of the quick menu, I'm going to change this into Super 35 because when I'm shooting events, often it's reach that's more important to me. Either full frame lenses with that added boost of shooting in Super 35, again that 1.5 times crop, or using Super 35 lenses. Double slot recording for events. Don't ever shoot an event on a single card slot, please. Just double slot recording. You want that redundancy. They won't be able to do it all again for you. So make sure you get that right. Pre-recording on because you can, and if you are that bit delayed to press the record button for any reason, just have pre-recording on. It gives you that safety net. Now, depending on the sound, where the sound is being captured, if you're capturing the sound in camera, I would suggest that you put that into XFAVC 10-bit, as that's going to give you better quality sound than the HEVC. As far as I'm aware, the HEVC sound is compressed. The XFAVC sound is not compressed. If sound's important, XFAVC, but if space is important, MP4, HEVC, 420 10-bit. To be honest, the file size is not going to make that much of a difference between XFAVC and HEVC, as you're going to see. It's a very small file. So I'm going to put it in XFAVC, just in the assumption we need uncompressed sound from the cameras. Next up, I'm going to change C-Log 3 into either wide dynamic range or 709. 709 is my preference. If this is going to be something that I can do little tweaks with afterwards, or I want a nice wide dynamic range, but a file that's pretty much ready to go, which for long form events is definitely preferable because you don't want to be grading the entire thing. Change that to Canon 709, which is my preference. Wide DR if you prefer that. If you want to do zero work in post and you want to file it just straight ready to go, just change it to BT709. You'll get the least dynamic range from the camera in that mode, but it's going to save you some time in post. So whatever is your priority. For me, I really like the look of Canon 709. I think they did a good job with that one, so that would be my preference. Next up, I'm going to change this into 25p. If you need slow motion from the event, change it and keep it in 50p. Even though the file size is the same between 50p and 25p in this scenario, I'm going to change that to 25p anyway, because I want more megabits going towards my fewer frames. If you're filming like a panel or something where there's not a lot of fast motion, long up is fine. If there's a lot of fast motion, you can change that to interframe. It's going to be a much bigger file, so choose that wisely. But I would do it in 1080p. We're likely going to have more than one camera. I've never had somebody at an event ask for anything in 4K. I'd be very surprised if somebody did. It all depends on who your client is and what they want from the event and where this video is going to be shown. So I've never had a client asking for 4K for an event, so I would shoot it at 1080p. It saves a lot of space, and the 1080p looks absolutely fantastic out of the R5C anyway. So there you go. For an event, I would put the sensor mode at Super 35 to give me extra reach, because often the cameras are at the back of a hall, for example. Double slot recording, because I always want a redundancy file for any event. Pre-recording, in case I'm slow to getting that recording button pushed. XFAVC, because you've got uncompressed audio. Canon 709 is my preference, but you can have BT709 wide DR. Or C-Log 3 if you want to grade all that. 1080p usually for my clients. 50 megabits per second long up is great. And 25 frames a second is all I need for events. It also gives me an extra stop of light over shooting at 50 frames a second. And most events that I film at, the light is the worst thing and there's very little I can do about it. So having that extra stop of light is really useful. Following on from events, if you're filming B-roll for events, for example, doing a promo video for an event or for a festival or anything like that, here are the settings that I would recommend. So on the first page, depending on the lens you're going to be using, most of the time for events, rather than carrying a big full frame lens, I like to carry a Super 35 lens because it's just easier on my arms and my back for a long event. Also, they're smaller and more unobtrusive, so people don't notice them and they act more naturally, and so you can get better candid shots. It also gives you more reach so that you can be in the distance, be a bit of a creeper. Here, I'm going to change the second card record function into main and sub, which I'll explain shortly. Recording mode is going to be put into pre-recording because capturing candid moments at an event, the moment you see it, you want to start recording it, so at least you've got that extra second or so from when you raise the camera up or however you've got it set up, moving it onto them. You've got that extra little bit at the start of the file that might be useful. Going across to the second page, leave that in XFAVC, although you can use HEVC if you prefer. If you're shooting this video completely regardless of any other cameras capturing the event, then you can change this into C-Log3 and get the most dynamic range. However, I would keep it to whatever my other cameras are filming, or as close to what the other cameras are filming if somebody else is doing that recording. So if they're using a standard 709 profile, change it to that. It just means if you're intercutting your footage with theirs or theirs into your promo, things are going to match up much nicer. You can spend more time in post doing this, but this might just save you some time. With an event I've got coming up next month, we're going to be doing the recording the event itself as well as the promo video, so it works nicely to have the same profile in all of the cameras. For my resolution, even though the client's likely going to need it in 1080p only, I like to have the 4K as a main file. So we're going to go 4K long op because that gives us a nice balance between resolution and file size. And I'm going to change it from 25p into 50p. Again, for any B-roll, this means that I can slow things down to half speed and it gives me a bit more flexibility with the editing. Okay, and as I mentioned, on the first page, we've got main and sub recording, and that means going to the third page to set up our sub recording. I can now set this to a 1080p file, which means that that's something that I can archive rather than archiving a 4K file. So when I deliver the first video to the client, they'll get a 4K file, but then I can have the 1080 as a long-term archive solution rather than archiving 4K. Plus, if I'm handing the files off to somebody else, I can give them a much smaller, easier to manage file than a 4K file. The frame rate, keep that the same as the main recording. There's no reason to change that. Unless you are handing this over to somebody else and they say, give us interlaced footage instead of progressive footage. I would be very surprised if anybody ever said that to you. But the option is there. So that's my preference for shooting events B-roll or making a promo video for an event. Having lighter lenses with the Super 35 and more reach and more conspicuous lenses. Main and sub recording, which means that I can hand off a 1080p file if I need to, and also store 1080p rather than 4K after the video is delivered to the client. Pre-recording to make sure I can get all the action or as much of the action as I possibly can. XFAVC or HEVC, it's entirely your preference at this point. Because I've got that smaller sub recording, I'm not too concerned about the main recording's bitrate because I won't be storing that in the long term. And I've always got that sub-recording that is smaller and more compressed. That's ideal. Okay, the final example that I'm going to give is shooting for YouTube. I don't tend to use the R5C for YouTube videos. I use the R8 or the R7 for that. But in the occasions that I do use the R5C for YouTube, on the first page, I'm going to put it into full frame because I want to have shallow depth of field. Often there is a mess behind me which I want to blur out, so having that narrow depth of field is good for me. Double slot recording because I don't want to have to do it all again if a card gets corrupted or anything. Normal recording because I'm the one pushing record. I don't need to have that pre-record function. Next up, I'm going to put it into MP4 HEVC 42010-bit because I will be having it in Canon Log 3. There's not a lot of color work for me with the grading on these videos, so I don't need to worry too much about 422. Although I do like to use Canon Log because grading these videos is quite fun. Something I'd always recommend for YouTube is upload a 4K file, even if you're only shooting in 1080p. So convert that to a 4K file and then upload it. The reason being is you get less audio compression than you would if you uploaded a 1080p video. And there's no sub-recording on the third page because we're doing double slot recording on the first. So those are the settings I would recommend for YouTube. Phew, that was a mammoth recording. I'm not sure how long the video itself is going to be in the end, but I hope there's been some useful information if you are recording similar scenarios to me. And if there's anybody who has any improvements they can recommend to me or want to inform other people about, critique what I've recommended as well, please put those in the comments so everybody can learn from your experience and your expertise as well. And if you found this video useful, please also do let me know in the comments so I know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future. But thank you very much for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. God damn, nice work. We shall see you in the next one.